history remembers Tycho Brahe as the man who mapped the stars. It tends to gloss over the pet moose, the dwarf who claimed to see the future, the gold nose, and his death from politeness. Hello and welcome to The Obscure, a podcast describing interesting people that deserve to be better known. We take interesting characters from history, out of obscurity and into the limelight, focusing on a different character every episode. I'm Daniel Darkens.
And I'm Nina Bickerton. We will be producing a new episode every fortnight, landing wherever you get your podcasts on a Saturday morning, if you're in the UK. Subscribe so that you don't miss each new episode.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Obscure. I'm joined again by Minna Hayman. Minna, how are you this week?
I'm very well, thank you. Still broiling in the Mediterranean heat.
The subject of today's story is Tycho Brahe.
Tycho Brahe.
And that he is was a Danish astronomer. Okay, so the story about Tycho is I have relied on three written sources for this. Firstly, a book from 1841 called The Martyrs of Science by somebody called Sir David Brewster. Secondly, a lovely little book called Rebels and Reformers, Biographies for Young People by Arthur and Dorothea Ponsonby, which was first published in 1919. And a more sensible sounding book called Great Astronomers by Sir Robert S. Ball, which was published in 1895. So that's 1841, 1895 and 1919. If you can say one thing about my research, it's always the latest cutting edge publications that I'm using.
Okay.
I think lots of people will have heard of Tycho Brahe.
Tycho Brahe.
I'm going to get it right by the end of the podcast
Okay.
if it's the last thing I do. He was born on the 14th of December 1546 into a noble family at the family seat of Knutstorp.
Mm-hmm.
To say he was born into a noble family is only really the half of it. His blood could hardly have been bluer, with about 6 different noble families all contributing to his lineage. He was the eldest of 12 children. He was actually a twin, but his twin brother died before he was baptised.
Okay.
Now, being quite a posh family, obviously, it was also a strange family. The two kind of go hand in hand, don't they? And there seems to have been some sort of deal done between Tycho's father and his brother. I just called him Tycho, didn't I? Tycho.
Yeah. Tycho.
Tycho Brahe.
Tycho. Between the father and the father's brother before he was even born. And it seems as though Tycho's father promised his brother that his first son would go and live with him. But when the son came along, his father reneged on that deal and said, no, I'm keeping him, until a second son came along. So at the age of 2, Tycho went to live with his uncle. He was raised in somewhere called Tösterup Castle, which is still in that Scania region, but it's about 80 kilometres away from where he had been born. Now, the uncle was so incensed that Tycho's father didn't honour the agreement that he actually abducted the young Tycho as soon as the next son was born.
Goodness. Well, it could be something to do with also the noble families actually tended to foster each other's children for whatever reason. And if they had this deal before, in general, it was very, very typical for children to be fostered in a different family, actually.
So typical, but still strange.
Very strange to us, yes, absolutely bizarre.
It seems to have worked perfectly well in this situation. He was educated by private teachers until he went to Copenhagen University in 1559, which is before his 13th birthday. They really did start uni young in those days. He actually attended to study rhetoric and philosophy, and he'd have been expected to end up going into a fairly high-ranking political role in due course. Lots of his immediate ancestors had been privy councillors to the King of Denmark, for example. However, he was feeling a little bit aimless until something happened in 1560 which set the course for the rest of his life. There was basically a solar eclipse had been predicted. Now, Brahe himself was born at an important moment in astronomy, in the development of astronomy. 3 years before he was born, Copernicus had died, and Copernicus is really seen as the father of modern astronomy. When Brahe was 17, though, there was an Italian baby born that would ultimately take Copernicus's ideas and run with them to such an extent that would get him into trouble with the Pope. And that Italian baby was christened Galileo Galilei. So he was right between those two. But back to the eclipse. If Brahe had been in southern Spain or North Africa, he'd have witnessed the entire sun being blocked out by the moon. But in Denmark, there would have still been a significant partial eclipse, similar to what we will see in much of Western Europe 2 days from the date of recording on the 12th of August 2026. But what really struck Tycho was not so much the eclipse itself, it was the fact we knew it was going to happen. The astronomical events were predictable, and he wanted some of that. So the eclipse happened on the 21st of August 1560, and at the time Tycho was 13 years old and he was able to view it. And I'm going to just use the phrasing from the book The Martyrs of Science. When he saw the sun darkened at the very moment that had been predicted and to the very extent that had been delineated, he resolved to make himself master of a science which was capable of predicting future events. I think that is a really nice way of putting it, particularly when you consider the importance that was placed on astrology, which, let's be frank, is not very good at reliably predicting future events. So he started out by buying books setting out the planetary motions. Now, he did find in some of the documents that he found some discrepancies in the predictions of things like conjunctions of certain planets, which he took to be either down to not being precise enough with the information and measurements or errors in transcribing numbers. And he thought careful observation and accurate recording would allow more reliable information. And if that is combined with more accurate, better instruments, then that would allow us to make more reliable, more accurate predictions. And bear in mind, we're talking 1560 here. The telescope had not been invented. It was all done using just the naked eye. I guess it's not really fair to say just the naked eye. Although we didn't have telescopes, Tycho had a range of instruments that could assist with measuring angles and elevations, which would have been a huge help in tabulating the relative motions of bodies against each other.
Weren't sea captains using sextants and things like this already by this time?
They would, yes, and a lot of the instruments that Tycho was using were like sextants that were big enough to sink a boat.
Yeah, okay, not very usable for a sea captain. In order to get to the West Indies or whatever, but nevertheless,
No,
I think, like, you know, it was a miniature version of probably that what people in a fixed tower would be using.
Yes, I think the principles that we're talking about are exactly the same. The next thing to talk about, though, is that these days, if you ask an astronomer about astrology, you're going to get pretty short shrift. They're not the same thing.
Nope.
One is a rigorous study of stars, planets and other phenomena using a range of measurements and observations. The other is a load of bunkum practiced by charlatans who try to convince people that having Jupiter in Pisces somehow means something significant will happen to 1/12 of the population, but not everybody else. Now, if that makes me sound a bit cynical, that's just because I'm a typical Taurus.
Yes, but it was a very, very important part of the worldview at that point in time. And was it Dr. John Dee that Queen Elizabeth had as the official court astrologer who was
She
consulted
did.
for plenty of important things like certain dates which were propitious and etc.
Yes, absolutely.
I saw in the Vatican Library fascinating globes that, to my surprise, when I started to look at a little bit closer what the figures were, it was a complete sphere looking like a globe, but actually there were all the astrological signs. And that was quite literally for seeing how the stars were going to be at a particular time, and completely in a papal palace. It was part of the
Yes,
worldview
yeah.
at the time.
Yes, and although astronomers would be quite rightly dismissive of modern day astrology, if you reference the star Aldebaran, they would still talk about that being in the constellation of Taurus. So there are still the echoes of those constellations still with us today. I'm fascinated that you mentioned John Dee being the court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, because you're absolutely right, but he wasn't there for his entire life. He actually left Queen Elizabeth and went and worked for somebody else. Do you know who his next employer was after Queen Elizabeth I?
Was it the Rudolph II?
It certainly was Rudolph II, yes indeed, whose name will crop up later on in today's story. Now, back in the 1500s though, and you're absolutely right with what you were looking at within the Vatican Library there, astrology was seen as almost completely overlapping with astronomy. Actually, Tycho, part of his time was taken up creating horoscopes for the well-to-do. So on the one hand, he was undertaking some of the most rigorous observations, measurements and recording that we had seen at any point in human history until then. And then in the afternoons, he'd be writing about the astrological importance and how auspicious this would be. And he was probably looking at the more accurate my records are, the more accurate future astrological predictions will be. Didn't get that one quite right then. Now, when he was around 18, the uncle that had kidnapped him at 2 passed away, and he doesn't really figure much in the story at all, but I do like the manner in which Uncle Jürgen passed away, because he was crossing a bridge on horseback in company with the King of Denmark. But whilst crossing it, the bridge gave way.
Oh dear.
And the two of them, with their horses, plummeted into the water, and Jürgen saved the king from drowning. But he contracted a chill and died just a few days later.
Oh dear.
It does appear that drinking may have been involved.
Fancy that.
Now, Minna, who do you think is the better at maths out of the two of us?
Oh, I will bow out gracefully immediately. I am not going to dispute this one at all.
Well, I'm not sure I wholly agree, but if we couldn't agree, if you thought you were better than me and I thought I was better than you, we'd kind of get over that, wouldn't we? You wouldn't want to fight me to decide.
No, I think that the good old school test might be a better...
You're going down the practical route again. Why do you keep going down the practical
I'm
route?
Scandinavian.
Oh, so was Tycho. And so was Tycho's distant cousin.
Okay, I'm Nordic. Let's put it this way.
Yes, that's probably better. Let's go with that.
I'm from further
because
north.
Yes, because when Tycho attended the University of Rostock, after he'd left Copenhagen, he went to Rostock, and it just so happened that a distant cousin of his was also attending this particular university. And one evening in late December 1566, so this is when Tycho was about 20 now, there was an argument between the two cousins as to who was the better mathematician. And because they couldn't settle it just by discussion, it didn't even occur to them to do some sort of maths test to see who got the higher score. They decided the only way to settle it was to hold a duel in the dark. Mm-hmm. So they did that, and I'm afraid Tycho came off second best because a blow from his opponent actually chopped off his nose. He did have a prosthetic nose made, which I've seen described as being made out of pure gold. I've seen it described as being made out of pure silver, and I've seen it described as being made out of a mixture of gold and silver, which I think they call electrum, don't they? Back in 2012, researchers from Denmark and from the Czech Republic announced that they had actually done some analysis of the remains of Tycho, and they are satisfied that his false nose was actually made of brass. Now, I'm not too fussed about that. I don't find that too disconcerting, because why wouldn't he have a Sunday best nose and a normal working day nose?
One for holidays and one for weekdays and etc. I mean, obviously.
I know I would. If I had that opportunity, I absolutely would.
Accessorize with your nose tip.
Yes, quite. Now, when he finished his studies, which was only a little while later, that was in April 1567, so still when he was 20, he did some travelling around. He visited Rostock, he visited Augsburg, Basel and Freiburg. He was appointed a canon at Roskilde Cathedral, and that seems like it was a kind of a sinecure, if you like. So he had a job, he had an income, and he didn't have to do anything.
Yeah.
And that allowed him to devote himself to astronomy work. Now, whilst he was at Augsburg, he built a great quadrant. And this is the thing that looks a bit like a sextant. But when we say great, it was pretty great. It measured 14 cubits across, which I have done some modern conversions. And I've done one modern conversion taking account of the last person we spoke about. Basically, 14 cubits is somewhere around 21 feet or 6 metres, or according to Indian Peter Williams, and about the size of a small alligator.
Yeah. Okay, maybe that's convoluting it a little bit, especially in the size of the alligator. But anyway, I mean, we will give that Peter.
Yes, but about 6 metres across. I'm just going to read a quick extract here that describes it. It says, the best artists in Augsburg, clockmakers, jewellers, smiths and carpenters were engaged to execute the work. And from the zeal which so novel an instrument inspired, the quadrant was completed in less than a month. Its size was so great that 20 men could with difficulty transport it to its place of fixture. So not much use as a ship sextant then. No. The two principal rectangular radii were beams of oak. Mm-hmm. The arch which lay between their extremities was made of solid wood of a particular kind, and the whole was bound together by 12 beams. It received additional strength from several iron bands, and the arch was covered with plates of brass for the purpose of receiving the 5,400 divisions into which it could be subdivided.
Yeah, me.
I have an image of this quadrant, and a quadrant is a quarter of a circle. So that's 90 degrees divided into 5,400 divisions. That's a 60th of a degree accuracy. That is pretty darn accurate.
Yeah.
It certainly would have been the most accurate astronomical device created to date, certainly in Western Europe. So that would have allowed him to very accurately measure the elevation of night sky objects. And if he's undertaking the observations at the same time every night, that would allow him to really map the motion through the sky of individual items. Now, in 1571, an uncle set him up with an observatory and laboratory, and Tycho's interest in alchemy grew. So not just astrology, not just astronomy, he became very interested in alchemy. And one source that I looked at said that basically as his interest in alchemy grew, so his interest in the night sky waned, and he might have given himself over completely to alchemy if it hadn't have been for the fact that on 11th of November 1572, he was enjoying a clear night sky, making his way to supper from the laboratory, when he noticed something that he hadn't seen before. There was a brand new star in the sky. It was in the constellation of Cassiopeia, and he published his findings the following year. He described the brightness of the new star as being close to that of Venus.
Wow.
Now, he didn't know it at the time, but what he had witnessed was a supernova.
Okay.
Actually witnessing with the naked eye, this was the first one in about 400 years
Okay.
that had been visible.
So it would have been, in relative terms, it would have been very close then to...
Yes, exactly. Absolutely correct, yes. Now, there was another one, believe it or not, just 32 years later, that was actually witnessed by his prodigy, Kepler. So we had one in 1572, one in 1604, and we haven't had one since that's been visible in the Northern Hemisphere.
Okay.
So they're quite rare. It is really quite lucky that he saw this one, that this happened in his lifetime. Now, the most flowery of the sources, that's the one written by the Ponsonbys. That suggests that this new star was heaven sent to get Tycho back on track with astronomy and stop wasting his time on alchemy. Now, he doesn't seem to be the first person to have noticed this, but he did note its position. He was the one who logged its growing and fading brightness. It is often still referred to as Tycho's nova now,
Okay.
or in the English-speaking part of the world, probably called Tycho's nova.
Tycho Brahe,
There are actually a few different things that are named after Tycho Brahe, and quite rightly so. Now, it was not really usual at this time for the nobility to spend their time on pursuits like astronomy or alchemy. They'd normally get somebody else to do it.
Or they had their house alchemist or somebody cooking up noxious potions and trying to find philosopher's stone and stuff like this. Highly scientific person.
Exactly. What Tycho was doing was a little bit unusual, that he was doing it himself.
Yep.
And something else that wasn't really usual for the nobility to do was to marry peasants. Now, because it's unexpected, that's exactly what Tycho did. In 1573, he married a peasant girl called Kirsten. It was undertaken in a way that's called a morganatic marriage. And what that means is that it was a marriage, but it was a kind of almost a compromise marriage, where he was able to retain his titles, but none of his children or his wife had any entitlement to them whatsoever.
Yeah, that's just it, that there is no passing down to the children born to that marriage or whatever. They don't have any rights. So
Yes, which is a shame, because they spent the next 30 years together. They had 8 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood, but we really don't know what happened to Kirsten or to the children after he died. They kind of just faded into obscurity. I'm sure they were provided for, but we don't know what happened to them.
yeah.
Now, at this time, the King of Denmark, I just love the fact that he was King Fred. It was King Frederick II of Denmark. Now, he was quite keen to have Denmark kind of on the map from a scientific point of view. He'd have absolutely loved Niels Bohr. So he was quite easily convinced by Tycho that a big observatory was needed. And he actually gave him the island of, and I stand to be corrected by you here, Minna, Ven, which is an island in between Copenhagen and mainland Sweden. And what he did was he built an observatory there, which became known as, or which he called Uraniborg. And it was the largest observatory in the Christian world.
Wow.
Now, it was a smart move. Building an observatory on an island in the middle of the sea, there would have been seclusion. So that means no disturbance in terms of extraneous light. There wouldn't have been movement. And there wouldn't have been people just knocking on the door to see what he was getting up to. So he could...
Or cousins trying to cut off your nose.
Now, the observatory looks like it was quite something. I've seen a list of 28 major items, including things like brass parallactic rules which revolved in azimuth above a brass horizon 12 feet in diameter. Now, I think it's obvious enough what that did, so I don't need to explain any further there, do I?
Right.
But he was finding that even with things like air movement, he couldn't quite get the accuracy that he was after. So he built a second underground observatory on the same site that he called Steenberg, which is effectively like Mount of the Stars, I think it kind of translates to. And he also had a lovely house to live in as well. Didn't cut any corners on this project, and apparently spent nearly a ton of gold on the arrangements. At today's gold prices, that would be somewhere around £100 million sterling, which is a lot of money. But in terms of its drain on resources, because that wasn't paid for with Tycho's money, that was paid for by the state of Denmark. And that was around about 1% of the entire national budget of Denmark. That is one heck of a project.
When you think about it, I mean, at the time, the importance of ore, exactly, I mean, the beginning point was that the king wanted Denmark to be a basis for scientific excellence, etc. And why he was willing to foot the bill was because I think that this was exactly the thing that the royal houses were competing. I mean, this was an incredible time in the sense that you had the new world discoveries, and apart from the usual power struggle and everything else, they were also kind of competing against each other. I mean, Renaissance at its fullest flourishing and bloom.
Yes.
They were competing against each other in the prestige of scientific discoveries, etc., and it was really coming to the fore. So I can sort of understand the investment that a king would be willing to make.
Yes, and you mentioned the New World there. I have just got a note here that the next time an American complains about the fact that how much money is spent on NASA, that is around 0.33% of the annual budget of the States. This is 3 times as much as the US spends on NASA. So it was a huge commitment. And I think you're spot on there. The reason for that huge commitment was because of the level of importance placed upon it. Now, around the end of 1577, there was a comet visible in the night sky, which of course Brahe closely monitored and recorded. And he also observed that the tail of the comet always pointed away from the sun. He was able to estimate its distance from Earth, and he calculated that it must pass through the orbits of at least 2 of the planets. And I think this gives an indication of the level of awareness of deep space at the time. Was the fact that it passed through the orbits of at least 2 planets meant that the planets had to exist in space, not as part of solid spheres,
Yeah.
which was seen as a distinct possibility at the time. Now, he was a religious man, as nearly everybody was at that time, and he wasn't really comfortable with the idea that the sun was at the centre of everything, like Copernicus had suggested, even though that's what the observations suggested. So he developed his own alternative model where the Earth is at the centre, the sun orbits the Earth, and the moon orbits the Earth, and everything else orbits the sun whilst the sun is orbiting the Earth. Now, I wanted to know a little bit more about Tycho the person. Who was he and what was he like? And he seems to have been a little bit of a complex character. He often entertained guests at the castle that he built on the island of Hven, but he was quite a forthright character, and he wasn't scared of making his views known. So, yeah, remember, he didn't back down when arguing about how good he was at maths. In terms of a physical description, he was described in one of my sources as a broad-shouldered, burly-looking man with short, bright red hair and a thick moustache curling over an auburn beard. When he was at Uraniborg, he kept a pet moose. Now, I've put moose brackets or elk. Now, this pet elk was free to roam around the grounds and the house.
Ah, okay.
Now, given your familiarity, when you were in Finland, did you often see elk around the place?
No. They are basically what you have to imagine is massive animal that has very long legs.
Yes. And that, I can see that would be a problem if, for example, you were a moose that wanted to climb a flight of stairs.
It would be definitely a problem because their legs are the same way like horses or cows or whatever. So, you know, they really can't actually go up or especially downstairs.
No. Particularly with the length of leg that you're describing, with a huge grey animal on top of these skinny long legs. Do you think an excess of alcohol would help with that, or would that hinder?
No, I think that it would give it very bad ideas of its ability, but I don't think that it would improve the performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can imagine what happened then during a party when the pet moose got very drunk, tried to go up the flight of stairs. I'm afraid it came back down again, broke its leg on the way down, and did later die from the injury. So if anybody is considering getting a pet moose, keep it away from the lager. Now, he did upset some people, though, not just during parties. He seems to have created areas where there was a bit of a grudge against him, and he gradually fell out of favour. One of the reasons why he might have fallen out of favour is that his work with alchemy seems to have worked. And I'm saying this from a point of view of incredulity, because it seems that he discovered an elixir that could actually cure ills. And you can imagine how well that would go down with the local doctors, that somebody would go along to the doctor, fail to be cured, maybe leave the doctor even worse off, and then say, right, that's it, I'm off to see Tycho Brahe, and suddenly they get better. Now, I think that even if all he'd done is given them a drink of water, that might have been better for them than some of the preparatory lotions and potions that might have been prescribed by the doctors of the time. But he had this secret elixir. Now, I kind of think of it that it was a closely guarded secret what made up this elixir, but he sent a sample of it to Rudolf II in Prague. And this is kind of the first interaction with Rudolf, is that he was very pleased to be given a sample of this elixir, but he wasn't after a sample. He wanted to know how it was made, and he would have wanted his own alchemists producing it. If you've got this elixir that can cure all ills, so he wanted it to be produced. So he said to Tycho, how do you make this stuff? Because bear in mind, this Rudolf II created an entire street for alchemists' workshops. And I love the fact that it's still there. And both of us, at very different periods, have visited Golden Lane in Prague. I was there back in the second half of the 1990s, and obviously, Minna, you were there earlier this year, weren't you?
Yes, fascinating, lovely place, and you should visit again because they have really sort of not refurbished so much as to they kind of set up the Golden Lane, the workshops in such a way that you have like a complete, say for instance, a cobblers or goldsmiths house set up and like how people lived at the time, and you can peek in there and see what they are like, and it's fascinating place. But he was particularly interested in alchemy.
Tycho did tell Rudolf what was in the elixir, but it seems that he didn't record it for the whole of posterity. We've got hints of what was in there. I've read in one place that there were more than 60 separate ingredients. And I've got one particular source that says that the base of this remarkable medicine is Venetian treacle, which undergoes an infinity of chemical operations and admixtures before it is ready for the patient. Now, it's difficult to establish what Venetian treacle was, but there seem to be, as I say, at least 60 separate ingredients. It sounds like there was opium, honey, snake flesh, and powdered gems as well, just to name a few of the 60 odd that were in there. So I guess if it didn't kill you, it made you stronger. But this particular elixir, quite something.
Yeah, I think that if you're given opium, you would probably be feeling slightly better, at least momentarily anyway.
Now, there were quite a lot of the great and the good visited Uraniborg. I think it got quite a name for itself as this centre of learning for astronomy. And one of the visitors was King James VI of Scotland. And he visited in 1590. Now, at the time, he was King James VI of Scotland. Give it another 13 years and he would also be King James I of England. Now, it made sense for him to visit because he had just got married to Anne, who, when you look at the genealogies of the British royal houses, she's referred to as Anne of Denmark. She was the sister of the King of Denmark at the time. But he seems to have really enjoyed his time there. He spent 8 days at Uraniborg and seems to have taken a really genuine, close interest in the work that Tycho was doing. He gave him a magnificent donation and also a licence, the King's licence, to publish his works in England as well.
Very important.
So even at this stage, in 1590, things were going well, but they were starting to decline, because he had made some fairly powerful enemies. It wasn't just the doctors. The doctors influenced more important people who influenced more important people. And once King Frederick died, things got worse there. He lost his role as canon of Roskilde. He lost some of the other income streams, so that he wasn't really able to maintain the observatory at Uraniborg anymore. He ended up actually downsizing to a house in Copenhagen in 1597, but his enemies weren't satisfied. They wanted him crushed. They wanted him gone. One of his most powerful enemies seems to have been a council minister called Valkendorp, who seems to have really taken a dislike to him after some form of disagreement. And so effectively what they did was they tried to get the new king to cut off all of Tycho's ability to carry on his work at all. So it wasn't just a case of take away his money. He'd have always been able to find some more money through his illustrious family. It was almost to prevent him, to ban him from doing the work. And Tycho quite quickly got disillusioned with Denmark because of that. So when an invitation came to stay at a castle near Hamburg, he was only too keen to accept. Somebody called Count Rantzau invited him to this castle near Hamburg, and he was a confidant of Rudolf II. So Count Rantzau introduced Rudolf to Tycho and Tycho to Rudolf. And Rudolf, as you say, he surrounded himself with strange. He absolutely loved strange, didn't he? Tycho would have been just his type of guy. From what I can pick up, one of Rudolf's favourite portraits of himself was undertaken by an artist called Archimboldo, who I'm sure you've seen some of Archimboldo's work, the trompe-l'oeil stuff. And in 1590, Archimboldo had painted this wonderful portrait of him. So Tycho was just Rudolf's type of guy. He helped to increase the profile of him as a patron of the sciences, while at the same time being a little bit odd. So Tycho actually moved to Prague in 1599, and he would spend the rest of his life at the court of Rudolf, continuing his observations and his meticulous measurement of the celestial bodies. He was given everything he needed by Rudolf, and he was so delighted that he actually is recorded as saying, as he could not find words to express his gratitude, the whole heavens would speak for him. And I think that's a delightful thing to say, but he kind of stuck to his word, because his work was so influential that it still echoes down the years. Now, a year later, Johannes Kepler arrived in Prague and studied under Tycho only for 3 or 4 months. So he's his most famous student. He had students throughout his adult life that would become like assistants and learn the astronomical practices from Tycho. When Kepler came back to Prague the following year in 1601, it was Tycho that pressed Rudolf to appoint Kepler as court mathematician. Luckily, they didn't have to argue over who was the better mathematician to get the job. But the understanding was that if Rudolf appointed him court mathematician, Kepler could still do some work for Tycho. And Prague really embraced everything scientific at the time. They embraced learning at the time. It was home to one of the oldest and best universities in the whole of the northern area of Europe. And I think you recently visited the Clementinum building in Prague, which houses some of the products of that learning. Is that right, Minna?
Yes, it has the astrological tower, and it has the fantastic Baroque library, which houses just, what was it? This was like tens of thousands of volumes, which were collected from all over Europe, etc. And the astrological tower was very, very important and very much in use. Well, actually to this day, because they have some of the measuring instruments that are still sending a signal to the meteorological department in Czech Republic, and the town crier would actually sort of shout out the official time of the day from top of the tower there.
Ah, of course, yes. Now, I've seen a couple of things about it, and I have to visit this place myself. I mean, I know it blew you away. Now, at the time of Tycho being there, it would have still been a Jesuit college. So I don't think he would have actually been set up within that building, but it kind of pays homage to him, doesn't it? It remembers him, and is a brilliant place. Now, it's his relationship with Denmark seems to have been, again, slightly complex. I think everything through his life was slightly complex because he felt very harshly dealt with in terms of the fact that he had been the absolute darling of Denmark during the time of King Frederick. He had then been effectively dismissed from the country, but I think he was quite often homesick. And he hadn't really learned the native language within the Czech Republic. But he was still very active socially. So he would mix with lots of noble friends. And on the 13th of October, 1601, he was attending a feast at the house of a nobleman called Rosenberg. And during the course of the feast, he basically had an urge to visit the toilet. But it really wasn't the done thing to get up from the table. And that would have been seen as discourteous to the host. And I'm guessing that going where you sit would be even more discourteous.
Yeah, not done thing.
No. So he held it in until he got home. And he actually caused a bladder obstruction. By holding it in for so long, he caused an obstruction within his bladder which appears to have become infected. And I'm afraid just 11 days later, on the 24th of October, he suffered a renal failure that caused his death on the 24th. So I've actually suggesting that he died of being too polite.
Well, yeah, I suppose this would be kind of the consequence of that, but not breaking the etiquette actually broke him. So.
Now, Kepler was present in Tycho's dying hours, and I think it's probably fair to call the completion of the astronomical tables, which are called the Rudolphine tables, that Kepler complete the tables was a dying wish of Tycho. So he died on the 24th of October 1601, which is just over a couple of years after arriving in Prague. He would have been 54 years and 10 months old. So when I was under the impression that he had done his best work, most of his work in Prague, that's how wrong I was. In a career spanning 34 years, only the last 2 of those were in Prague. But the impact was so long-standing. Kepler finished the tables, and they are still called the Rudolphine tables, after the sponsor, obviously. But having finished the tables, Kepler then used those to establish that the planets didn't move in a circle. And that was what Copernicus had believed, is that the sun is in the middle and the planets move in circles around the sun. Because the circle is kind of a perfect shape to move in. And even with the Tychonic model, where you've got the Earth at the middle, the sun spinning around the Earth and all of the planets spinning around the sun, that was still based on circles. So now, what it suggested to Kepler was that actually all the planets move in an ellipse. And he put an awful lot of work into kind of disproving his own findings, because he wasn't happy with an ellipse. Ellipse isn't what God would want. God would want circles. So he was trying to create what we call epicycles, where something moves in a circle as whilst moving in a bigger circle, so that it kind of looks like an ellipse when it's not. But eventually he had to give best and say, actually, it clearly is an ellipse. And all of these tables, the life's work of Tycho, eventually brought about Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And we still refer to those laws of planetary motion now. The idea that the closer you are to the sun, the faster you move, the further away, the longer it takes. All of those laws came about because of the information that was available to Kepler, and that information was generated by the amazing Tycho Brahe. Now, when he did pass away in 1601, Rudolf II was very upset to hear about this, and he ordered that Tycho would be buried in the finest church in Prague. And he still lies, to this day, he lies in Our Lady at Tyne Church on the Old Town Square. If you sit in the Old Town Square of Prague, you've got the medieval clock tower with the wonderful astronomical clock to one side, and over, as I recall, if you're facing the astronomical clock, over to your right hand side, you've got the wonderful twin spires of Our Lady at Tyne, and that's where he still rests to this day. So he passed away in 1601, and just to kind of pick up on him, he was a man of contradictions. I think he was clinging to alchemy and astrology whilst he was actually helping science, proper science, if you like, take a great leap forwards. He could delight people and offend people with equal ease and frequency. He made lots and lots of friends, but he also created powerful enemies. One thing I haven't touched on yet is that he also had a servant of whom he appeared to be very fond. And Lep, or Jeppe, or Jep, back to the Danish pronunciation. He was a dwarf who would act as servant, jester, and prophet. And he was actually treated better than any other staff that Tycho had. He was allowed to live in the main house. No servants' quarters for him. He lived in the main house. He would eat the same food as Tycho would. In fact, he would sit under the dinner table very near to his master. So he'd have the same feast, but sitting under the table by his master, where he would sometimes mumble something cryptic that would instantly draw Tycho's attention, because he was convinced that he could foresee the future. He would dress him in the finest clothes, he would have the finest food, and it was really unusual that somebody would be looked after, what is effectively a paid jester would be looked after in that way. So we can think of Tycho as a diligent student of the cosmos, whose work paved the way for our current understanding of the mechanics of everything that's up there. He was possibly the last of the great naked eye astronomers. Galileo came along when Tycho was only 17 years old, and he would develop a telescope in 1609. So just 8 years after the death of Tycho, we had the first telescopes. And by 1610, Galileo had seen the 4 largest moons of Jupiter orbiting something that wasn't the sun or the Earth. We can also think of him as being a bit of a relic of an older time, the alchemist, the astrologer, and he was determined to make the astronomical models fit his Christian beliefs. But he was also really superstitious at the same time, in quite an unchristian kind of way. If he left the house and saw an old woman or a hare as he left the house, he would turn straight round and go back indoors because of the bad luck that that represented.
But this went completely, along with the fact that people wanted to have their horoscopes and firmly believed that this this was, and somehow it seemed to go, perfectly well with the fervent religious beliefs and so forth, etc. So it
Yes.
was just very funny time.
Now, the program is called The Obscure, and I do feel that it is right that we've included him within this. But if we have people listening who think this is the first I've heard of Tycho, it might be the first you've heard of him, but it won't be the first you've seen of him. Because anybody who has looked up at the moon has seen Tycho. Because the brightest crater on the whole of the moon, down in the northern hemisphere, if you're looking towards the bottom of a full moon, there is a very bright crater with rays spreading out from it. It seems to fill on the right, in the right conditions, it seems to fill about a quarter of the visible portion of the moon. And that crater is Tycho, named for this wonderful astronomer. So the next time you're out and you're looking at the moon, that's Tycho, and you really can't miss it.
Well, that's the naked eye one, so it makes perfect sense.
Yes. So he was absolutely so important, but I've called him satisfyingly eccentric, with the pet moose, the dwarf prophet, the gold nose, and the death of politeness. So what do you think, Minna? Is he obscure enough for our podcast, do you think?
I do think so, considering the fact that he's a fascinating character once again, who led incredibly interesting life, etc., accomplished so much, and unless it's still kind of like, unless you look him up, it's not something that would easily come across or whatever, as in, unless you go to these places or somebody mentions something like that to you, that that the crater on the moon is named after him or whatever. It's I think unfortunately he's somewhat obscure.
Until now.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I'm really pleased to have had the opportunity to talk about him. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about him, and I'm very much looking forward to our next episode, which will come in 2 weeks' time from today. So thanks very much for listening.